Hey, I'm excited to introduce my friend Kendra Bybee. She has been a family history enthusiast for 15 plus years, and she's got a great sense of humor, which talking to her, you've got to have definitely a sense of humor when you're working on African American family history. She's also an incredible artist and has done some art related to family history. And just if you're interested, she goes by K Dawn Creates on Instagram. Okay, Kendra, take it away.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Kendra Bybee. I like that they called me a family history enthusiast. It was kind of born out of necessity. What I'm going to do today is just kind of talk about my own process and trying to do my own family history work because family history for particularly descendants of enslaved people, African Americans, and other people of color is a little tricky. So I'm just going to kind of go through my own process. And if you have questions, please let me know. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully it works this time. All right.
Got it.
Perfect. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is kind of steps to building your family tree. And I've kind of summarized these into like three groups. So it's ask questions, search obituaries, and then input new names into family tree. For a lot of people, the very first one, ask questions, might seem a little bit odd because people kind of assume like, don't you know who you're related to? So I can say from my personal experience of doing family history, I didn't know who my paternal grandfather was for sure. So I had to ask a lot of questions. The thing about this, as particularly when you're working with people of color, is to remember that sometimes the family doesn't want to give up things that they deem to be secret. And so it can be a little tricky. So you might have to get like a little creative. So let's go to the ask questions. So the first thing I did when doing my family history is to ask people in my known family. And I, of course, have written, remember that some may be reluctant to discuss. So I had a really big champion in doing my family history work, which was my maternal grandmother. And I don't think there was like, I don't know if there was any question that my grandmother wasn't afraid to ask. And so when my dad would come and visit her, she would start asking questions for me. So she'd be like, what's the relationship here? What's this? And sometimes my dad would answer and sometimes he wouldn't, but she would do this so that I could kind of hear and kind of see what's happening. So the other part of that is as you're asking questions, write down all of the names. So when I'm doing family history, what I do is I literally have a blank piece of paper. I have one kind of here. There's like a blank piece of paper like this, just computer paper, and I just write down every single name that somebody mentions. If possible, it's great if you can write down dates and places. And I just keep going. And sometimes my paper just looks totally nuts as I'm writing. I try to write really fast, but I keep track of that because you will have to refer to that piece of paper later. There's not in African-American history, there obviously are not a ton of written documents that have been passed down from family to family. You have to remember that enslaved peoples, most of the time were not allowed to read, they were not allowed to write. So the stories of like, they passed down a family Bible, that didn't happen very often, maybe later on. So you really have to be creative in these questions and what you write down. So the next step that I do is I search obituaries. So I think the tendency when we do family history work is we think I'm going to get on newspapers.com and I'm going to find obituaries. That has not worked for me. So I actually go to Google first. And what I do on Google is I literally just go through pages and pages and pages. So it's helpful to remember that your results might not be on the first page. Don't get discouraged if the first page comes up and you're like, I don't see anything. Sometimes you have to click further. And the reason obituaries are important is that a lot of times, if you know like one name, what you can do is read all the names of other family members. And that's really, really helpful. So I had to do that in trying to establish my paternal family tree is I searched obituaries. I wasn't connected to that side of the family. So I would search obituaries and then I would put all of the names that were listed, I would somehow put them into my family tree. And so that I could get some more information. And sometimes there might be names that you don't know about, but go ahead and write those down on like your blank sheet of paper because they may be helpful later on. If it's possible, it's really important to make sure you double check the places that are listed because duplicate names are pretty common, especially the further back you go. It is very common for somebody that is African-American to have the same name as somebody who is actually of European descent. So it's really important that you check the places and keep in mind what was happening with these dates, right? So after, like during enslavement, they're not keeping great records. And a lot of times the families kind of settled where they became free. So what you do is you just got to make sure you check the places. I know. And searching for my paternal grandmother, one of the things that I had to do was really double check the places. So if she was born in Georgia, that's a lot of times where they end up settling down. And so you kind of have to look and make sure the counties match and all of that, because again, moving is not, wasn't as common as it is now. So then after that, the next thing to do is input the names into family tree. So I usually use ancestry.com. And the reason that I use Ancestry is because I can keep my family tree private. And that works better for what I'm doing. So once the new names are input, a lot of times you'll start to get some hints for the names that you've listed, which I really enjoy. But again, at this point, you might want to make your tree private as you kind of sort out relationships, okay? So I have had to do that on and off to keep my tree private as I try to like figure out, is this person related to this person? Is this person? It just makes it a little bit easier. And then that way, if your tree is private, you don't risk, you don't run into accidentally sharing information that doesn't need to be isn't correct. So that's really important. So if you've done these things, you've asked questions, you've searched the obituaries, you've input the family names into the family tree, then it's kind of like, what comes next, right? So, so what I like to do after I've done those things is I start to use the hints on Ancestry. And I try to make sure that I've done the three things I talk about: ask questions, search obituaries, and input the information. I try to do those three things first before I go to hints. So a lot of times federal census records will pop up. So this is something that a lot of people don't think about, but it is extremely important to double check the race of the names given. It's very, very important. A lot of times, like I said before, there will be duplicate names. And I've had people before who have been like, I think you're related to this person, but they haven't checked the race. Again, I have a mixed race ancestry. So it would not be uncommon to find someone who is not African American in my family tree. However, I have to look at the dates. So the likelihood that I have like a fourth great grandmother who's of European descent, given the time period, is highly unlikely, because a lot of times the children are not, like, they would not be listed with a mother of European descent if they are African American. Okay. The other thing to remember when using the census is that the names might not be spelled correctly. Again, enslaved people were often not able to read or write. And so when they're giving the census, sometimes they're telling the census worker one thing, and the census worker decided to write down something else. So you might have, so for example, I have some Reeves in my family. We have like Reeves, Reaves. I think I've seen a couple with C's, and it's the same people, but you've got to like, you kind of have to start digging at this point, okay? Because the names are 9 times out of 10, you're very lucky if they're spelled correctly. In my family history, they have not all been shared correctly, spelled correctly. So the next thing I say is to start with 1 or 2 people and then build from there. We get really excited when we get hints, right? We're like, oh my gosh, I have some hints. I get to do all of these people. So really what you want to do is you want to start with a couple of names. I like to start with most recent. So finding like my paternal grandfather, I started a long search for that. That's what I was working on. It was just trying to find this grandfather. And then once I had as much information as I could on him, then I started to go backwards. And the reason that I say to start with 1 or 2 people is because there's going to be a lot of information that you're going to want to, that will help clarify information for other ancestors. So actually, in prepping for this class, there was this name on my family tree, and it looked right. And there was even an obituary attached. And I thought, this is great. This person has all of this information. I can do this. And then I started to kind of look more, and there were some things that didn't match. Like the name matched, but then the husband's name didn't match. And so then it was like, well, maybe this person had 2 husbands, maybe this or that. Well, what happened is that the wrong information had actually gotten input. And so I had to end up deleting this person, putting in what I thought, doing a little more research, putting in what I thought their actual maiden name was, and then I was able to work backwards. So that's why I say do 1 or 2 people, get like as much information as you can. You've got census records, obituaries. Sometimes there's land deeds. There are also Social Security information, Social Security index, and then also there's like a death index. And sometimes marriage certificates are helpful, but not always. So that's why you just want to collect as much information on these 1 or 2 people as possible. So then the next step is DNA testing. So there's a lot of, in communities of color, there's a lot of discussion on DNA testing. I like DNA testing because it can open up more in terms of relations and in hints, right? And so I found that to be helpful. But there's also some kind of downsides. So you get really excited when you have a DNA match, right? And it's really easy to be like, we match, so therefore their information is my information, and we put it all in the tree. But it's really important to do your own research and to cross-reference as much as possible all of the information. So, because not everyone is going to have the correct information in their trees, particularly in African American history, family history, a lot of us are kind of at the same starting point where we're not quite sure who this person is. We've heard about them and we're trying to collect it. So there are going to be some missteps along the way, and that's okay. But just, I caution against, don't add everyone's information directly into your own tree immediately. Now, it's really important when you find like a DNA match. That's one of the great things that Ancestry does, where they tell you, you and this person share this, and it's probably this. It's really important to carefully reach out to the DNA matches. So, because there are some family relationships that will have been kept secret, okay? So I've had that experience in building my paternal family where I thought, okay, we've got these people, and I had DNA matches that reached out to me. I'm a little bit shy to initiate, so they reached out to me. And I thought, oh, I've got all of this wonderful information. What I didn't know is that there were some other relationships, but the rest of the family didn't really know if everybody knew about them. And so I had to wait a little while. And then I found out that there was this whole other section of family that I didn't know about. So it's really like, as exciting as it is and wonderful that there are DNA matches, it's really important that you carefully and respectfully reach out to the DNA matches. So here's some things to kind of remember when doing African American family history. So there is most likely going to be trauma in what you discover. You might discover enslavement, you might discover assault, there's probably going to be poverty. There are a lot of things, and those can be really hard for people of color. Um, and I always recommend to seek counseling. If you find something that you feel like, oh, that's really painful, I always think it's important to consider counseling. And if you're helping someone who is of African American descent, I think that we also have to be conscientious and have some grace and knowing that what they discover could be really traumatic. And so we need to make sure that we're, really wanting to help people. The other part is I say, check, double check, and triple check your sources. This is not a process to be rushed because like I said before, there are duplicate names. And sometimes what it will be is it will be an enslaved person and they happen to have the same name as their enslaver. So you have to really slow it down. And sometimes that can be discouraging, right? Because you just want to know, right? You just want to know all of the stuff. But just if you can slow it down a little bit and allow yourself to kind of just really get into the process and enjoy it, that's really helpful. And then I've written about the duplicate names. So sometimes there are duplicate names in the same family. So on my maternal side, one of the things I kept running into is there's like 3 or 4 men who all have the same name. The only difference is the middle initial. If you don't know that, it's very, very tricky. I was like, what was my great so-and-so doing? How did you end up with the same person over and over? No, they were all 3 different people. It was like a great grandfather and then a grandfather and then a father, like all the same name. The only difference was sometimes the middle initial. 2 of them have like the same middle initial. So when you run into that again, always check the race of the person in question. I get a lot of hints on Ancestry sometimes that will say we found so and so, and I think, oh, okay, that's great. And then they tell me that this name that I've been looking for was actually on like a ship going to Canada. Now, knowing what I know about history, what's happening with enslavement, what's happening post-enslavement, I know that is most likely not my ancestor. And so it's really important to just like, you gotta dig at the names a little bit. The other thing to remember when you're doing African-American family history is that just because you have a family tree, it does not necessarily equal a biological relationship. You have to consider divorces, death, there's separations, there's informal adoption, etc. So somebody who is listed as the father may not be the actual biological father, okay? Which will require a little bit more work on your part to kind of figure out who the person is. But that is something important to remember, and it can complicate things. But as long as you're like kind of remembering that, it kind of helps. And kind of the last thing that I kind of say about things to remember when you're doing African American family history is that you might make mistakes in assembling your family tree, and that's okay. Sometimes you have to go in, you have to rectify, you have to take things out, and then you can move forward. I had a situation again where I was, putting in the information of, I thought it was the correct person. I had checked all the boxes and everything, and someone reached out to me and they said, that's not right. And I was like, what are you talking about? Of course it's right. I did all the research, right? And they were able to show me where I had gone wrong. And I was deeply appreciative of the person. They did it in a really kind way. And I could have it's always hard when you've done so much research and you find out like, just kidding, you were wrong. But it's really important to know like, hey, mistakes are going to happen. Sometimes you've got to take people off of trees and put in the correct information. That's okay. And then you can kind of move forward. So those are kind of the main points that I wanted to kind of talk about. just like starting African American history. Are there any questions? Because I'm a little short on time, but I would love if you have questions so we can talk about them. And I will stop sharing my screen. Hold on. Okay. Okay. Someone asked, how far back in both your maternal and paternal side of your family tree were you able to go when you hit any brick walls? That is a really good question. So I am about at my fourth great grandparents. And for me, that's huge. I grew up knowing, like, I could go back to my second great grandparents. So I've been able to add 2 generations. The likelihood of me going back is not, it's not likely. I'm probably not going to get back any further. And a lot of that is due to like a lot of people that I've met on Ancestry that are DNA matches. So they've done a lot of the work. And so I'm really grateful. A lot of them actually like went to the places, these birthplaces of our ancestors and dug through records. And so that's how I have that. So there are definitely brick walls. I feel like I run into them all the time. I have like when I do family history, if I do it for like an hour, that's good because I've probably hit a brick wall at that point and I'm going to get really frustrated and it's not going to be fun anymore. So yeah, I was able to get back to my fourth great grandparents and I'm calling it good there for me. Are there other questions?
I'm not seeing, let's see.
There's one that just popped up.
Yeah.
Go back prior to the 1870 federal census or afterwards?
That is a good question. I'm trying to think. Yes, I was able, I think I can go back to, what did I just look at the other day? I think I got back to the I want to say 1830s, which was a really big deal. Further than that, I don't have any high hopes after that of going back.
Somebody's saying I found records of slave with only the first name. So does this mean that they're related?
What do you mean by records? Like you found?
Let's see.
It's in the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
slave.
Usually I would say, that it doesn't necessarily mean that they're related. It just depends on who's doing it. Yeah, so you can check sometimes, you can check plantation records of the family you're researching. And is the family you're researching African American or is it of European descent?
Of the family that they're researching.
Right.
So we've done the same thing. We were of European descent and found a book that had the name of the enslaved person. And then I was able to find the enslaved person's spouse and child, put them in family search. And with the new feature in family search where you can show relationship, I could attach her to the family that she was, where she was enslaved.
Right. So I think
that kind of helps at least identify who that person is.
Yeah. So she's saying the family she's researching is European. Okay. So if the slave is listed, then they are most likely, I mean, it's tricky. I can't say for sure. They're probably not related. It was, you have to remember that enslaved peoples were considered property. And so they were listed. And the more enslaved people that you had, the more wealthy you're considered. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they are related. A lot of times what happens is, remember when enslaved peoples were brought over to the Americas, they were stripped of their names. And so they were just given, pretty generic names, John, James, Mary, that kind of thing. And then a lot of times what they did is they ended up, their last name was the plantation owner. So it's not impossible that they're related. I would just say it's maybe not highly immediately likely.
So there's a question.
Yeah. This question is asking, did I find any freed persons of color in your tree, and what records if so? So that's actually a really good question. So there's a lot of, in African American history, a lot of not just African Americans, but other people of color. There's a lot of oral traditions, a lot of oral history that's gotten passed down that is not unfortunately written. So I found the oral tradition of my family is that, you know, oh, they were not enslaved, they were free at the time, and they had this land and all of that. So I've tried to look into land deeds. I've looked on the Freedmen's Bureau. I have indigenous ancestry, so I've looked on the Dawes registry. I've looked through all of that, and I haven't been able to find them. And that's just my case. It probably will take a little more elbow grease and grit on my part to find them. I know for some people, Freedmen's Bureau is a good resource. They're able to find some of their ancestors. If you have indigenous ancestry, the Dawes list can also be helpful. But again, you have to remember that a lot of there's a lot of people that were lost, that were not recorded, and so that does make it difficult in trying to assemble and specifically attach sources to that. And so that is another reason that I say ask questions, because a lot of times there's an oral tradition that has been passed down, and that might be your only source of history, and it might kind of tell you where to go, but you might not ever get the entire answer.
So I have a question. If you have
Yes.
that oral history, do you write down that oral history and then do you go back and like annotate on that oral history of what you found according to that, so you can leave that record for those coming behind you?
It depends. I know in some families, and in some cultures, it is not appropriate to write down oral tradition. A lot of people don't. In my family, I might be one of the first people who's actually like writing it down. And it is really tricky because of that tradition, the oral tradition. People are very reluctant to have things written down, very reluctant to take DNA tests. A lot of people in my that I know are actually even reluctant to share pictures, just because they've had so much taken away from them due to enslavement and colonization and all of that. It's very hard to kind of trust that the information that they're giving is going to be used in an appropriate manner. So it's really up to the group of people, and according to cultural practices.
Okay, I had no idea that oral traditions, some people didn't like to write those down. I'd be the first one there with a piece of paper and a pen. So
Yeah,
I'd get myself
that's
in
what
trouble.
you think. That's yeah. I mean, that's kind of like how we're
Geared.
trained, right?
Yeah.
We're kind of geared to like, oh, we're going to write everything down, and it's not appropriate for every culture.
Huh. Okay.
It looks like I did such a good job. No one has any questions. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
It's fascinating.
You've given us a lot that we have to think about now. It's yeah.
Yeah. So I hope that those 3 steps kind of like help people get started and not get discouraged. And like I said, I think I showed this earlier. I think I showed my blank piece, but like this is a piece I was doing family history the other day. This is my paper. Like, see, there's just names. I've crossed things out. I write dates, all of that. And I just literally keep it in my office next to my computer. And so every time I come, I'm like, oh, that person, oh, that was actually so-and-so. And then I just cross out. So that's actually really important, is to know, is to know who you're actually dealing with.
So who did you start asking in your family? Who was the first person that you talked to, and were they forthcoming, or did they, kind of hem and haw, like, do you really want to go there?
So the first person I grew up with my maternal side of the family. I didn't grow up with any paternal side of the family. And so the first person I actually asked was my dad, who was very, very reluctant. As he's gotten older and I've gotten nosier and more persistent, I've gotten a little bit more, and because I've actually done a lot of research on my own, I've been able to add pieces in, and so we've been able to. We're actually in the beginning of reconnecting with our family. So I asked a lot of questions there, and then my maternal side, I grew up with the stories of like my family history and whatnot. So I didn't ask a ton of questions, but my grandmother always had a lot of questions about our family and how we kind of been scattered and, different things she had grown up with. So, when my grandma would talk and just tell me a story, that was kind of my question asking. And that's something else to be said is like a lot of times the people that you want to ask that you're close to, sometimes they've told you stories that you just need to pay attention to. Okay. So like my grandma is originally from Arkansas. I've been to Arkansas a handful of times, never met anybody, whatever. But she started talking about as she got older, kind of like spending time in Arkansas and those things. And so I started to kind of pay attention and kind of memorize these things. And if she mentioned a name, I would try to like remember that. And then I would kind of follow up with my mom to be like, Grandma mentioned so-and-so, who is so-and-so? And she'd be like, oh, she'd give me a little more story. So like, when you start asking, you are not going to get this huge, like, pedagogy. That's not what you're going to get. You're going to get these tiny little stories that kind of build your family history, like that's very close to you. And then eventually you're able to go backwards. And that's really important to remember in African-American history, especially when we're asking people like, oh, just bring your family history, right? I always got asked that in school. Like bring your family history and we can talk about it. And I didn't know my family history. And it was really painful and it was deeply embarrassing. And so you got to remember that family history is the history that your family shares. And you might not go back very far, and that's okay. It's painful, but that's kind of where you start.
Okay, got a couple of other comments. One, is there any way we can help genealogy when we find slavery in our family when recording and researching?
Yes. So the most important thing is so somebody once told me, they said, we have a family Bible and we found all of the names they listed all of their enslaved peoples. I said, that's like really important. If you can make like a separate family tree for that person, that's actually really, really helpful. And I've had a couple instances where I've had to like actually reach out to someone like, oh, okay, you have this person, how are they? And so then that helps me figure out who, the enslaver versus the enslaved, all of that. So it's really, I would say maybe start at that separate family tree. If there's, I'm not super familiar with European history and family history, but if there's a way that you can like put that into like a computer or give it to like a society or something so they can like record that is actually really helpful.
Okay, another comment. After writing down my family stories and then researching, I found many errors in the stories. Some were true, at least in part, but not all.
Yeah, yes, because tall tales seem to be like a thing that our ancestors like to do.
Well, they're a thing now too, if you don't get painted in a good light.
Right.
So we just do it on Facebook and stuff now.
Yeah. You do have to be careful. You got to take stories with a grain of salt. I know. So sometimes this is another thing in African-American family history is that sometimes you might run up against a lot of prison records now. And that's not necessarily because they've committed a criminal act. Like you could just be arrested for being Black. Okay. And so you will run into that. And sometimes there's stories that have been manufactured around this person. And so you kind of do have to take it with a grain of salt. I kind of think it's fun to be like, oh, I love that you told me that story and none of it's true. That's so sweet. And I still write down the untrue story because that is still part of our family history. If part of my family history happens to be that we tell tall tales, then so be it. I'm gonna keep track of the tall tales.
It adds excitement.
Yeah, of course it does.
Okay.
I just
Any other?
Go ahead. That the new person page in Family Search, if you go down to the bottom of it, it has a place where you can add other relationships. And so if you found a Bible with a bunch of names of enslaved people in it, you could create an individual person account, on every one of those people. You could tie them back to whoever was the person who had them enslaved, so that they know it came from that Bible, and that might be a nice, helpful way too. And that's just, that's a new feature.
Yeah, I like that.
That's great.
Someone wrote, I found separate sections for Black obituaries. What records have you found showing separation races? Yes. So this is very common. African Americans were not allowed to be buried in the same cemetery as Europeans. And there's the whole history, there's a whole backstory about this. And yes, it's very common to find separate sections of Black obituaries. So the records, like I said, I look at the census, and then what church records are actually really helpful. So churches, particularly because they are Black churches, you might be able to find a little bit more information that way. Same with military records. They separate on race. Prison records, they're separated. So there's all these separations that you kind of have to go through, and that was according to what was happening historically. Historically, we were not all meshing together. So that's why it's really important when you check a census record or an obituary. A lot of times with obituaries, there may be pictures. If not a picture of the person, then there may be a picture of a relative. And then if there's not even that, what I've done is I've actually Googled the churches or searched the churches so I can find these people. So you do have to get creative, because yes, things were very separated. And you may actually, when you get further on, you may actually have to, now we have the internet and these smartphones and stuff. So it's a little easier, but a while back, you would actually have to go search through county records or church records, or go search the cemeteries. It's a little bit easier now. But yeah, you kind of have to, you got to get creative, because there was definitely a separation of races at the time.
It sounds to me too that it would be very helpful to know just regular history of what was going on in the areas where your ancestors were, because that affects so much of what was happening, and how they would have been treated, or where they would have been maybe segregated or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it is helpful. There's obviously certain time periods that it's just, the history is unfortunately pretty similar across the board. So you do have to, like I said, you do have to get really, really creative. If you have, I say, for family history workers, for people who are helping people of color, not just African Americans, it's very important to have a racial literacy, which means that you have you have really tried to understand what was happening. You're trying to understand where these family stories are coming from at this angle, because a lot of times we look at these stories with a lot of judgment automatically, like, this is crazy. How was she, a single lady who had 8 kids? Well, you have to take into account what was happening. Families are being separated, husbands are being sent other places. So it is really important to have a racial literacy when you're working with people of color. This is not your standard family history. You can just open the Bible and you figure out everybody. Takes a lot of creativity, and like I said, and there is a lot of trauma in that, and that's something to be really cognizant of as you're helping people of color assemble their family trees.
So how do you be, if there's trauma, I mean, how do you ask questions and not sound like you are not, sometimes even asking a question comes across as judgmental. How do you ask without sounding like you're, hammering them? You know what I mean? Or the stories, or that's, when you think about that, because, I mean, for me, me, I ask dumb questions just because I'm ignorant. Yeah, okay, that's where the racial literacy comes in. I understand. I'll work on that. But, I mean, sometimes as missionaries, we don't know what we don't know.
Right.
So when we go to help somebody, the concern is, I mean, we don't want to be idiots about it, but we need to know maybe how to ask the question in a more appropriate way.
So I say in those cases to let the person that you're helping lead a little bit, because you can tell a lot by a person's mood, right?
Right.
Don't get so gung-ho to be like, oh, look, I found this person, right? Like, I've had that happen a couple times. Someone's like, I found this person. And I've been like, hold on, let me check. And then I've checked, and it's actually more insulting when I find that the person hasn't double checked, like they haven't checked ethnicity first thing out the gate. That's like, okay, that's really tricky. So it's racial literacy is very important. It's also to kind of let the person that you're helping lead, and to know that you're like there to like support them and encourage them. And this is not like a check, we got your family history done. It's not, it doesn't usually work like that for people of color.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good to know.
Yeah. And another thing I would say is if you have questions on family history for people of color, I recommend the podcast Love Your Lineage, because that's what they're talking about. They're talking about some of the hard things and the history of people in the family history of people of color and kind of how to deal with that. And so that's actually really helpful if you are looking to gain some insight into family history or even into how to better help your friends of color. I can't recommend that podcast enough. It's very, very helpful.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?